China and Western countries have been squabbling over exchange rates for years. The United States and many other countries accuse China of buying dollars to keep China's currency weaker than it would be otherwise. That makes China's goods cheaper in other countries, and it makes it more expensive for the Chinese to buy from foreigners. In the United States, politicians and regulators say China's policies undermine exports, costing American jobs. Knowledge at Wharton has invited Professor Mauro Guillen to explain what's at stake and why this conflict is so hard to resolve. Is it true that China's currency policy is costing American jobs?
Well, it is true, but at the same time, it's not accurate. It is true insofar as, it is harder for American companies to sell in China if domestic consumption in China doesn't take off. And one of the reasons why it's not taking off is because their currency is undervalued, right, artificially. But the other thing that one must keep in mind is that the Chinese weakness in terms of their currency is also affecting the competitiveness of U.S. exports in other markets, like in Japan. I was stunned to read the other day an article, a very well-done article in an economics journal, showing that the overlap between American exports to Japan and Chinese exports to Japan is exactly 87%. Which is astonishing. That means that Chinese producers and American producers are actually competing with each other in third markets, such as, for example, Japan. So I think it is true. Now, by the same token, it is not true because, you see, countries really can both benefit from global economic exchange. So China and the United States don't really compete against each other. American companies and Chinese companies compete, right? Companies compete, countries can actually both win. So I think the way to frame the debate right now should be how can both China and the U.S. benefit from the global economy?
There's been so much sort of hue and cry over this that I'm curious whether the countries that are criticizing China, to what extent they have a legitimate complaint, and to what extent it's just convenient to point the finger at China and tell your people that it's China that's causing this problem.
You're absolutely correct. It is convenient, to ask somebody else to revalue their currency, because that automatically, within 24 hours, essentially, makes your own products and services more competitive in the global economy. So it is convenient from that point of view. Now, having said that, unfortunately, the Chinese currency is not traded in the markets, so we don't know for sure what its value should be. But I think there is wide agreement that its value should be higher than what it is right now. But let me also add that what is really complicated matters is that there's a lot of uncertainty as to what the relationship will be between the dollar and the euro. Because, there are large deficits here in the United States. There are problems, political problems in Europe. It is still a question mark whether European countries that are members in the Euro system are going to be able to, continue having a common currency or not. So I can also understand the Chinese. The Chinese don't want to make a move when there is so much uncertainty as to the relationship between the other two important currencies in the world. Because they could, make a mistake, right? If they choose to revalue, let's say, by a certain amount relative to the dollar. But that also will change the way in which China relates to the Eurozone, right? So given that there is so much uncertainty right now, I think it is the wrong moment from the Chinese point of view to engage in a realignment.
So that sounds a little like the classic chicken and egg problem. And what do you think it'll take to break through that and get some resolution that everybody can live with?
Well, one option is to try to organize once again the coordinated action that took place back in 1985 with the Plaza Accord. At the time, if you remember, the G7, China was not a player because China actually was not a very important economic power at the time. The G7, though, got together and they decided to intervene in the markets so that the value of the dollar would slide very, very slowly, right? And it did drop in value by 40% within, 18 months. And that was needed because the U.S. was, again, running big deficits and had a problem with competitiveness. And that really, helped everybody overcome the many problems that were besetting the global economy back then. So today what I think is the best case scenario is that not the G7, but we need the G7 plus China perhaps also India and Russia, right? But especially China, they need to come together, and they need to come up with some coordinated action. And right now, I think the four main players, because those are the four big currencies in the world, are so the U.S. with the dollar, the Chinese with the renminbi, the Japanese with the yen, and the Europeans with the euro.
And what is the Chinese incentive to accommodate the rest of the world on this?
Well, in the short run, they really don't have an incentive because the Chinese government needs the economy to keep on growing. And the Chinese economy grows because of exports. So they have a very strong disincentive to, revalue their currency because that would hurt their exports. Medium run, right, so let's say 3 to 5 years, or long run, 10, 15 years, it is in the best interest of the Chinese to actually do this. Why? Because China is getting richer. And as China gets richer, you would expect, which is what happened with other countries, that exports would decline as an engine, right, for economic growth, and the domestic market would start, being more important, just as has happened in the United States or as happened in Germany, way back.
That's the development of a more consumer-driven economy.
Market. But in China's case, there's another complication, which is that not all the Chinese population is enjoying the fruits of economic growth. So you have 300 million people who are now middle class, and some of them are really rich, right? But then you have another 600 or 700 million in the rural areas who are still living in poverty. So the Chinese approach to the problem is complex, out of necessity, because they are facing a very complicated issue. And for them, timing is very important. That's why I'm saying that in the short run, maybe next week or in 2 weeks from now, it doesn't make that much sense for the Chinese to give in to the pressure. Let's say 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, China, of course, has to develop its domestic market and has to, move in the direction that the Americans and the Europeans are now asking China to move.
Now, instead of the G7, we're often talking about the G20 these days, and they're meeting in November. Do you expect any kind of breakthrough there or progress of any kind?
I hope so, but I'm pessimistic. I think the G20 is, the very name of the group indicates it is just too large. It's very difficult to make 20 parties agree to anything. The G7 was already very large. Just imagine the G20. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I think the key players here are the United States, China, Japan, and the Eurozone, right? As long as those four can come to some kind of an agreement, then I think we will be in good shape. But that agreement has not, become a reality yet.
Now, are the Eurozone and the U.S. and Japan, are they of one mind on this, or are there divisions there as well?
No, there are divisions. And I think what happened last week with Japan's intervention to, try to slow down the appreciation of the yen demonstrates that in the absence of some kind of a four-way agreement, okay, then each of these countries, U.S., China, Japan, and the European Monetary Union, will try to go its own way and defend its own interests. And of course, that can be detrimental to global economic growth. Remember that the problem with the present situation is that we're coming out of a crisis, right? And the imbalances that led to the crisis in the first place, with big deficits in some parts of the world and big surpluses in other parts of the world, have not been addressed, right? So we continue to have this structural problem. And, politically, it's going to be hard because, once again, nobody wants to, at least until now, wants to give up something, right, in exchange for an agreement because there's so much uncertainty as to, when the global economy will start growing again in a robust way. We have the U.S. and Europe, with high unemployment. The political stakes are very high. This is part of the problem.
Now, is this situation slowing the world's recovery from the last recession?
I think it is. I think it is. And it is also, I think it is fair to say that it is also keeping the probability of yet another problem farther down the road relatively high. So we need to address these imbalances in the global economy. We need to find a way for the Chinese to feel more at ease with their new role in global economic affairs. And we certainly need to help them make the transition from being a poor developing country and becoming one of the leading economies in the world with a vibrant domestic market based on middle-class consumption.
So to summarize, you are not optimistic there's going to be any immediate breakthrough, but down the road it'll be in the Chinese interests to accommodate other countries.
Yes, I
as
just
you say.
don't think that right now, given the uncertainty in the markets, that it's going to be easy for these four, big economies in the world to come to an agreement. But I tend to think that in 2 or 3 years from now it will be easier. But I stand ready to be surprised by our political leaders.
Well, we'll all be keeping a close eye on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.